أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم صلى الله وسلم عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا رسول الله صلى الله وسلم عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله يا غريب يا مظلوم يا شهيد كربلاء يا ليتنا كنا معكم سادتي فنفوز فوزا عظيما. قال الله تعالى في محكم كتابه الكريم: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إنما المؤمنون إخوة فأصلحوا بين أخويكم واتقوا الله لعلكم ترحمون. God states in the Holy Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, indeed, the believers are brethren, so make reconciliation among your brethren, and be God conscious, so that you may receive divine mercy. Amanna billah, sadaqallahu al-aliyyul azim. Let us begin by enlivening our hearts and our minds and our gathering with the remembrance of the Holy Prophet and his purified progeny. Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala. One of the central themes of the Holy Quran is that it encourages the believers to maintain unity and harmony amongst themselves. And it discourages the believers from division and disunity and antagonism. This is a central theme of the Holy Quran. God tells us the very famous verse from Surah Al-Imran. He says, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. God says, and hold on all together onto the rope of God, and do not be divided. And then he says, وَاذْكُرُوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكُمْ إِذْ كُنْتُمْ أَعْدَاءً فَأَلَّفَ بَيْنَ قُلُوبِكُمْ فَأَصْبَحْتُمْ بِنِعْمَتِهِ إِخْوَانًا. God says, and remember God's favor upon you. God is speaking to the Muslims, to the believers. He says, remember God's favor upon you when you used to be enemies with one another, but God unified your hearts. He brought your hearts together so that you became, through God's mercy, you became what? You became brothers. And the Quran in many places, it encourages us, the believers. It reminds us of the importance of harmony, of living together in peace, in goodness, in avoiding division and conflict and tension. Now, one of the biggest and one of the most dangerous problems that our communities and the world, in fact, faces today is the existence of severe strife and conflict on various levels. If you take here, our country, the United States, as an example, we find that politically, on the political level, there's a lot of conflict and strife between those who are conservative and those who are liberal, between the Democrats and the Republicans, between all of these political factions, the ultra-left and the ultra-right, and all of these factions that no longer can cooperate on anything. They have conflict with one another on every single question, on every single issue. It is very rare nowadays that you find them being able to talk to one another, let alone cooperate. Politically, there's a lot of division, there's a lot of conflict. When we find amongst various groups, even amongst religious groups, there is conflict amongst religious groups. When we come to the state of Muslims, we find that there is intra-Muslim tension and conflict. Sectarianism is a problem. What is sectarianism? Sectarianism is when you believe in and you defend your group, your sect, your school of thought at all costs. At all costs. And this is a problem we find not just in other parts of the world, even here in the United States. Sectarianism, where people, they adhere to their school of thought, their madhab, above and beyond everything, by any means necessary, even if it means opposing the truth. This is the problem. This is where the problem is. We have between Sunni and Shia, we have conflict. You have those, here it happens as we approach the month of Muharram. Of course, we know the month of Muharram is the first month of the Islamic year, and every year we hear this. Leaders, Muslim representatives, leaders, scholars, others, groups who come out, and what message do they put forward? They tell people, happy new Islamic year. They promote this idea that we should be happy with the emergence of the new year. Just like we say Happy New Year in the Gregorian calendar, January 1st, we tell everyone Happy New Year, right? The same kind of message is being put forward. And then they discuss, some of them, not all of them, some of them, they discuss about the significance of Muharram. And they discuss the significance of Ashura. And Ashura, people are reminded that it is important and encouraged and mustahab and recommended to fast on this day. And hadith after hadith is given about how this day is glorious and how God, He saved Moses and He saved Adam and He saved Noah and He saved all of the prophets and all of the messengers and all of the miracles. They all happened on the day of Ashura. So people are encouraged to do what? To take this month seriously and the day of Ashura seriously. And then what happens? That's it. There is no mention of the tragedy of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. It's as though Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he belonged to a different religion. He's not the grandson of the Prophet of Islam. Right? And this message, unfortunately, what ends up happening is this message is put forward because in reaction to what some of these people, they perceive to see the quote-unquote Shia threat. Because the Shia, they commemorate Muharram and Ashura and they mourn and they remember Imam Hussein. So what do we have to do? We have to erase this. We have to forget about it. This happens. We have conflict. This is one small example. So we have tension and conflict on various levels. But this is not just between religious groups and political factions and even between Shia and Sunni within Islam. But unfortunately, what we find is that even in some cases, there is conflict and there is division even among the communities of the followers of the school of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. Even among the followers of the school of Ahlul Bayt, we find in some cases that there is animosity and enmity between us. And in the best case scenario, at best there is indifference towards one another. There's either animosity or indifference towards one another. We find that partisanship, al-asabiyya, partisanship, is prevalent in some of our communities, unfortunately. We have made ourselves into groups. This group follows X marja. That group follows Y marja. We are groups, independent groups. These people, they are from this country. These people are from this country. This group is from this village. That group is from that village. We have made ourselves into various groups and factions, and with these, unfortunately, in some cases, there are labels. So-and-so and so-and-so. There are accusations that we accuse one another of. Sometimes we condemn one another just because of the town that we come from or they come from, or the village, or the ethnicity, or the group, or the whatever it may be. This happens. This is very unfortunate. It occurs in some of our communities. And this is unsustainable, dear friends. We cannot function. We cannot function and survive, let alone grow and prosper as a community of the followers of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam if we are in conflict with one another. If we have formed divisions and factions amongst ourselves. It's unsustainable. The Quran reminds us. God says in the Quran, وَأَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ وَلَا تَنَازَعُوا فَتَفْشَلُوا وَتَذْهَبَ رِيحُكُمْ. God says, and do not be divided. Do not get into conflict with one another. Why? فَتَفْشَلُوا, because you will fail. The ingredient to our failure as a community is when we are divided, when we are in conflict with one another. When there is disharmony and disunity amongst us. And this is destructive. It destroys us. God says, فَتَفْشَلُوا, you will fail, وَتَذْهَبَ رِيحُكُمْ. And your power, what will happen to your power? It will disintegrate, it will vanish. You will no longer have any power. It destroys us as a community. And it brings delight and happiness to those who are our true enemies. When they see infighting, when they see factions and divisions and accusations and labels and condemnations between us, this brings delight to those who are our true enemies, those who oppose us when it comes to our religious and ethical and moral values. They're happy, they become happy. Because they no longer need to equip their resources. Because we do the job for them. We destroy one another. So it's unsustainable. And we have to work very hard in order to overcome this dangerous challenge, brothers and sisters. We have to work very hard in order to build and to maintain harmony amongst the followers of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, wherever they may be and however they may be, to build that sense of strength and harmony and to maintain it. We are reminded of the importance of reconciliation. This is what the Quran tells us in Surah Al-Hujurat. God says in Surah Al-Hujurat, وَإِن طَائِفَتَانِ مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ اقْتَتَلُوا فَأَصْلِحُوا بَيْنَهُمَا. God is telling the believers, He's saying, when two groups of believers, وَإِن طَائِفَتَانِ, طَائِفَة is a group, طَائِفَتَانِ is two groups, مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ, they're both mu'mineen, they're both believers, اقْتَتَلُوا, there is conflict and antagonism between them, فَأَصْلِحُوا بَيْنَ أَخَوَيْكُمْ, work towards making peace between your brothers. The Quran is encouraging us, telling us make peace. Reconciliation between factions that are at odds with one another. And then the Quran goes on to say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةً. Indeed, the relationship between the believers is that of what? Of brothers. They are brethren. They are brothers and sisters. إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةً فَأَصْلِحُوا بَيْنَ أَخَوَيْكُمْ. Once again, God says, and so make reconciliation and peace among your brothers. The Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, Allahumma salli alayhi. One day he turned to his companions and he told them, should I tell you what is greater in value, what is more worthy and more valuable than the level of prayers and fasting and charity? What's greater? Isn't prayers the pillar of our faith, Amududdin? Isn't fasting important for us? We have to fast. Isn't charity integral to our religious worldview? The Prophet says, I'm going to tell you something that is even greater than fasting and prayers and charity. What is it? He says, when you make peace between people. When you make peace between people. Two people are at odds, two groups are at odds, they're at conflict, and you work towards making peace between them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives you greater rewards than if you just stand and pray and fast and give charity. Our sixth Imam, and Imam Ja'far ibn Muhammad al-Sadiq alayhi salam, he says in the hadith that the greatest form of charity is making peace between people. The greatest form of charity. He turns to his companion Al-Mufaddal and he tells him, "O Mufaddal, if you find two of my followers, two of our Shia, they are at odds, they are at conflict with one another, here's my money, use my money to bring them together." Imam Sadiq would give his money to his companions and he said, use this to do what? Not just to give to the poor and the needy, this is excellent. Use this in order to make peace between people. So we find here that the Quran and the teachings of the Holy Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt, they encourage us always to work towards reconciliation. So how? How can we build harmony? How can we maintain harmony amongst the followers of the school of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam? I'd like to relate to you 5 points inshallah tonight. The first point is that it is important for us to recognize the history of immense diversity of viewpoints and approaches in our tradition. If you study the Islamic tradition and the tradition of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, the school of Ahlul Bayt, 1400 years, we find in this history there was a great amount of diversity in both views and approaches, beginning with the Imams themselves. The Imams themselves, just take the example of the Imams. How did they approach quote-unquote political issues? Compare between Al-Imam al-Hassan and Imam al-Hussein. Two brothers, both the sons of Amir al-Mu'mineen, both the grandsons of the Prophet. Right? We find that their approach, their political approach towards the Umayyads, Bani Umayyah, and the context was very different. Al-Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, he worked towards making peace and reconciliation, even to the point where he agreed to a peace treaty with Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, under of course certain conditions, right? Whereas you have his brother Al-Husayn ibn Ali, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he says absolutely not, there is no peace with Yazid. We stand up against Yazid. These are two brothers. Turn to their descendants, the descendants of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Turn to the life of Ali ibn al-Hussein, Zayn al-Abidin. Turn to the life of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir and Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam. They withdrew themselves from participating in politics and the numerous rebellions and the uprisings that took place. Then go further down the line. You turn to the time of Al-Imam al-Rida alayhi salam, Al-Imam al-Rida, who of course under that context, when he was summoned from Medina to Tus, and he was appointed as heir apparent to the caliph, right? We find differing approaches. They were all imam, they were all ma'soom, they were all doing their duty and their responsibility, but their approach, the method, the way they adopted was different. Why? Because the circumstances were different. The circumstances during the time of Al-Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen were different than the circumstances at the time of Al-Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. Even closer between Al-Imam al-Hassan and Imam al-Hussein, there is not much difference in terms of time. They were close in age and they lived as contemporaries. But the imamah of Imam Hassan alayhi salam, the situation was different than 10 years, only 10 years later with the imamah of Imam Hussein. Let alone several decades or several centuries. So we find the imams themselves, they adopted various approaches towards solving the problems and the issues that the community was solving, that the community was facing. When we come to the companions of the imams, we find that some of the leading companions, some of them, they differed sometimes with one another on some views. If you take some of the leading companions of the two Imams, Al-Imam al-Baqir and Al-Imam al-Sadiq, such as, for example, figures like Zurara or Abu Basir, these were great men. Great men, loyal companions to the Imams. They studied with both Imams. They were very close to both Imams. Yet we find, if you go to the books of Hadith and the books of history, you find that sometimes on some issues, Zurara and Abu Basir, these two experts, and this was the great thing about the Imams. What the great thing about the Imams was that they raised a community of scholars and experts. They made them experts in Quran. They made them experts in law, in theology. These were the companions of the Imams. The Imams taught them so that they could be experts and they could go to their respective places and they could teach and they could propagate. But we find in some cases, on small issues, some legal issues, some fiqh issues, sometimes they disagreed with one another and their disagreements are recorded. But we accept Zurara, we accept Abu Basir, we accept the rest of the companions as the greatest of the companions of the Imams. When we come to later generations, we come to after the Ghaiba, the occultation of our 12th Imam, we find the earliest generation of scholars, figures like Shaykh al-Saduq, one of the great scholars of our early history, Shaykh al-Saduq, and his student, Shaykh al-Mufid. These are two giants. Two giants. Al-Saduq wal-Mufid. And they were teacher and student. Al-Saduq, in one example, Al-Saduq, he writes a book called what? Called I'tiqadat ul-Imamiyya. The beliefs of the Imamis. It's a short treatise where he explains, he was asked in a majlis one day to give a short summary of the beliefs of the Imami Shia, the followers of the Ahlul Bayt, the Ithna Asharis. So he gave a summary of the main beliefs. His own student, Shaykh al-Mufid, who studied with him. Afterwards, Shaykh al-Mufid, he wrote a refutation of his teacher's book called Tasheeh al-I'tiqad, the correction of the belief, the creed. And he corrected, he said, this is my ustad, Shaykh al-Saduq said A, B, C, but he was wrong. It's not this, it's actually this. But in the process, if you read the book, he's highly respectful of him. He says, our teacher, Rahimahullah, may God have peace upon him and mercy upon him, he said this, but this is another view. He corrected him. He did not condemn him. He did not say this teacher, he has no idea what he's saying, he's lost, he is kafir, he is atheist. And we accept both Shaykh al-Saduq and Shaykh al-Mufid as giants of our tradition. They were the earliest scholars. And they were those who set the foundation for our understanding of our history and theology and law and so on and so forth. So it's important for us to understand this history of diversity, brothers and sisters. There were diverse views, differing approaches and methods. And if we understand this diversity, then we are able to understand that our tradition was not just a monolithic tradition, where there was no divergence at all. Yes, the core is one. The core is one. But sometimes there would be differences in some legal issues, in some approaches and methods of arriving at solutions to the various problems. So number one, how we build and maintain harmony, number one is to understand, to learn about the history of diversity of views and approaches in our tradition. Number two is to appreciate the power of diversity. Some people don't like diversity. They want everything to be exactly the same. They want everyone to do everything the same way. Everyone to look the same, speak the same, believe the same, act the same. They don't like diversity. But diversity has great power. There are benefits to diversity and differing views and approaches. Some very important and fundamental benefits to this. One is that it allows for our communities to have nuance and flexibility. It allows for flexibility. It allows for nuance. Again, if we come to our history, we find that our books of tradition, they give us examples where sometimes the Imams alayhim as-salam, they would, in some cases, not too much, but there are some examples, and I give these examples for us to think, that sometimes they would give different responses, different answers to some of their different companions and others who asked them, depending on various circumstances. The Imam understood. Maybe in the eyes of the Imam, this answer may not have been applicable to the person who came to him from Kufa, because his context is different. Maybe there was another reason. Maybe the Imam was operating under taqiyya, for instance, and so he would give a different answer. But we have within the tradition that the Imams sometimes they gave differing answers. And some of the companions, they would say, Zurara, sometimes he would tell Imam al-Sadiq, he would say, "Oh Imam," he asks him a question, the Imam gives him an answer. He would tell him, "Oh Imam, but your honorable father, the Imam, he gave me a different answer." The Imam would smile to him. He knows that Zurara is understanding, that Zurara is a scholar. He understands, Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam understands and appreciates that there might be some nuance. Not everyone is operating in the same way. There might be differences. There might be different contexts. Sometimes what works here in New Jersey might not work in California. What works in the United States might not work in Great Britain. What works in this part of town may not work in another part of town. So diversity gives what? Gives nuance. And we find this in our everyday lives. Those of you parents who have children, you don't operate with your children all on the same level in the same way. You act with your 2-year-old child in a different way than you act with your 10-year-old child and with your 20-year-old child. The rules, the approaches that you take, the ideas, the way that you approach things is different. Why? Because the age of the child is different. There's a different context. This is part of how we navigate our lives. So it allows for nuance and it allows for flexibility, brothers and sisters. If we understand this, we can overcome many of the controversies and the problems that we face. Take the example, the controversial example of moon sighting. Every single year, in the month of Ramadan and for Eid, our communities, they fight and they bicker amongst themselves regarding the sighting of the moon. And people, generally, especially if you can't appreciate the complexity of the legal issue, the fiqhi issue, sometimes they begin to accuse, "Oh, this marja' doesn't know what he's saying. He doesn't even know. He lives in a different world. He has no idea about reality. And his people don't understand." And this group, they begin to accuse that marja'. "Oh, that guy doesn't understand what he's saying." And there's infighting and conflict. And we presume that it's a very simple matter. It's easy. We should be able to solve this issue. But we don't understand that there is some complexity here. So, for instance, when we come to the maraji' and the scholars and the jurists who spend decades of their life, decades, not 1 or 2 years, 30 and 40 and 50 and 70 years, their entire lives. There's no retirement, They don't have retirement. They continue to operate and to teach and to debate and to write until the end of their lives. They spend their entire lives working in order to come to some of these legal solutions, right? And if we don't understand this complexity, then it's easy for us to condemn and to accuse and to dismiss. But if you take this example, right? When the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Allahumma salli ala, he says, "Sum lil-ru'ya waftar lil-ru'ya." This is one of the main reports of hadith that the scholars, they depend on when it comes to the issue of moon sighting. This literally means Fast when the moon is sighted, and end your fast when the moon is sighted. صُمْ لِلرُّؤْيَا وَافْطَرْ لِلرُّؤْيَا. It sounds simple, right? Prophet is giving us simple instructions. Fast when you sight the moon. Okay, what does sighting of the moon mean? What does it mean? If I tell you if I ask here, survey, if I take a survey here of everyone who is sitting here, tell me the meaning of sighting. Some of us will say, well, it means to see it with your naked eye. Some others say, no, sighting means that you can see it with binoculars. That's also considered sighting. The other side will say, no, we are sure that sighting can only refer to a sighting of the naked eye. This is just one issue. So this issue of language. Otherwise it's the same. They're not using different methodologies. They're not using different sources. We don't have one hadith that this group is using and another hadith that this group is using. They're both relying on the same hadith. But their approach to and interpretation of a word, simple word like ar-ru'ya, is different based on their understanding of the entire Islamic tradition. So they're employing these tools, and naturally, depending on the context and understanding and interpretation, there will be different views. And this is good, brothers and sisters. This is good that there are different views. We don't want stringency. It's difficult to have one size fits all for everything. It doesn't work for us. Because at the one hand, we want unity. We want everyone to do exactly the same thing. We want everyone to celebrate Eid on the same day. But there are many issues where if we ask and we are truthful with ourselves, you say, no, I'd like a little bit of flexibility and nuance. I live in the West, I don't live in the East. When it comes to some issues, I say, no, let's be different. This doesn't apply to me, it applies to people back home. Right? You can't have your cake and eat it too. We can't have uniformity, everyone does the same thing exactly. At the same time, we want flexibility and nuance. It doesn't work. So we understand the power of diversity. It gives us nuance. It gives us flexibility. It allows for dynamism when it comes to our tradition being able to keep up with various times and various places. We don't want to be stuck in the past. We don't want to be stuck in one geographic location. We want to be able to have this flexibility. So it's important for us, number two, to realize the power of and to appreciate the power of diversity. Number three, and this is very important, that we avoid suspicion and we avoid mistrust, assuming the worst in people, and we avoid negative competition and we avoid condemnation. The Quran says, Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu, O you who believe, اجتنبوا كثيرا من الظن إن بعض الظن إثم. God says, O you who believe, avoid most suspicion and conjecture, because some of it is a sin. The Imam, he says, when a person suspects negatively, they assume something negative about someone else. Imam says, when one believer assumes something bad about another believer, his brother or his sister in faith, what happens to them? He says their iman disintegrates just like salt disintegrates in water. You put the water and just stir it a little bit, what happens to the salt? It's gone. Imam says when we assume bad about people, we suspect bad about people, this destroys our very iman. This is why the Quran reminds us, don't suspect. Don't jump to conclusions. Don't assume the worst in people. Rather, the tradition, it encourages us to engage in what is known as husnul dhann, giving people the benefit of the doubt, assuming the best in people, not assuming the worst. Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali alayhi salam, he says in a very beautiful hadith, he says, ضع أمر أخيك على أحسنه حتى يأتيك منه ما يغلبك. He says, consider the case of your brother, whatever the issue it may be, assume the best in your brother. Assume the best until you are convinced with evidence. You are convinced that they have done something wrong. Meaning what? Meaning don't jump to conclusions. Don't suspect. Right? You know, in court, the prosecution, if any of you have ever performed jury duty, how many have performed jury duty? MashaAllah. You guys have to teach us the tactics. Huh? Yeah, you skip, of course. For those who have gone and performed jury duty, thank you for your service. May Allah bless you, inshallah. When you go and you sit there, the prosecution will come up and they will tell you that the evidence has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. Meaning what? Meaning they are going to present evidence for you, and this evidence has to be so strong that you cannot have another possibility. You cannot interpret this evidence with another possibility. This is what our tradition tells us. Tells us, assume the best in people. People are what? They are innocent, absolutely innocent, until proven with certainty that they have done something wrong. Not someone told me, or someone sent me a WhatsApp, or I heard this, or I heard that. No, you have evidence to the contrary. ضع أمر أخيك على أحسنه حتى يأتيك منه ما يغلبك. And then he says, ولا تظنن بكلمة خرجت من أخيك سوءا وأنت تجد لها في الخير محملا. And never suspect the worst in something your brother says if there is a possibility that you can interpret it positively. You hear someone say something, huh? The Imam says, unless there is no possibility for you to interpret what they're saying in a good way, unless this occurs, that's the only time when you can accept and say, okay, this was wrong. Otherwise, if there is even a possibility for you to interpret, to say, well, maybe they meant something else. Maybe this is taken out of context. Maybe I haven't heard the whole story. I've heard one side of the story. Huh? I've heard part of the story. Unless you have absolute evidence. And we have to be able to avoid suspicion, brothers and sisters. And we avoid those who are troublemakers. There are people who are fitna mongers. All you hear from them is destroying others, accusing others, condemning others, putting people down. You don't hear any construction. There is no constructive criticism. They're always destroying. Everyone is their enemy. Everyone is wrong. We have to avoid them. Some people, especially in this day and age of social media, and we'll talk more about social media inshallah in the upcoming nights. We find that some people, they make a living, brothers and sisters. You know this better than me. They make a living off of what? Off of controversy. Off of criticizing others. Because why? Because people like to hear this stuff. It's juicy. We like to hear about all of the problems in the world. We like to hear about controversy. So we go and we click and we watch and they get more views. And what does that do? Do we have any YouTubers here? Any aspiring YouTubers here? What happens? Most of the youth in the past few years, when you ask them, what do you want to do when you grow up? They say, I want to become a YouTuber. Aspiring YouTubers. What happens? The more clicks you get, the more views you get, what happens? The more cash rolls in. You get paid. Social media companies pay for views. And no one wants to hear a good story. We want to hear a bad story. This is what draws us. Right? Everyone, when there's a car chase, I don't know about here in New Jersey, but in California, there's always car chases, police pursuits. Right? Police pursuits all the time. People steal vehicles, they're running from the police. Everyone watches it live. We like that action. We don't like to watch someone who held the hand of an elderly man and he crossed the street and he helped him, or someone who gave charity. We don't want to watch that. That's not interesting. We want to watch controversy. And there are people who make livelihoods. They spend all of their time and effort and resources in order to engage in controversy. We have to avoid them, brothers and sisters. We avoid them like the plague, because they are destructive, they destroy. And even when it comes to how people deal with us, see, the Quran always encourages us, and the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, they always encourage us to be better than others. The Quran says to us that you should always pursue justice and truth. وَلَا يَجْرِمَنَّكُمْ شَنَآنُ قَوْمٍ عَلَىٰ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا. It's a powerful message. اعْدِلُوا هُوَ أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَى. God says, don't let the bad behavior of others, the wrongdoing of others, make you not pursue justice. Because sometimes this is how we operate. I say, well, they are condemning me. They are accusing me. So what am I going to do? I'm going to reciprocate. I'm going to condemn them. I'm going to accuse them. They're saying something bad about me. I'm going to say 10 bad things about them. The Quran says, no, be better. Be better. Don't let the wrongdoing of others, don't let the misconduct of others prevent you from maintaining justice. اعْدِلُوا هُوَ أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَى. The Quran says, pursue and maintain justice. هُوَ أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَى. This is closer to God consciousness. So that's number 3, to avoid suspicion. Number 4 is to engage in positive cooperation and collaboration. The Quran says, وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى. Don't engage in negative competition, engage in positive competition. فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ. In another verse, God says, compete with one another in what? In goodness, in building. This is the competition that Allah wants from us. It's a positive competition, a good competition, when we cooperate with one another, when we are hand in hand, when we bring our minds and our hearts and our hands together and we try to collectively figure out how to overcome our problems, to cooperate and to collaborate. We have so many common challenges, brothers and sisters, challenges that are common to all of our communities of the followers of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. Many challenges, common challenges. Instead of spending our time and resources in bringing one another down, we need to cooperate so that we can overcome our problems and challenges. We have issues, social issues, other issues. Our communities now, many of our communities, they face a problem of marriage. Young people are finding it difficult to get married for all sorts of reasons. We have the huge problem of schooling our children and the indoctrination of our children. They are being fed through TV, through social media, through school, all types of poison, all types of ideas that go against our very religious and ethical values. This is common to all of our communities. We have to be able to come together and help one another so that we can jointly overcome these problems, that it does not destroy us. We cooperate, تعاونوا على البر والتقوى, to reach out to other communities locally, in our local community, in our state, in our city, other masajid, other organizations. We don't have to necessarily reinvent the wheel, brothers and sisters. I know sometimes we get excited and we want to do everything. We want to reinvent the wheel all the time. Right? This community built a masjid, we need to build a masjid. This community built a school, we should also build a school. Huh? They built this, we should build that. They raised this much money, we should raise more money. We want to reinvent the wheel. Now sometimes it's necessary. It's necessary for some organizations and some institutions and projects to be built. But sometimes we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are people who are dedicated, they are mu'min, they've spent many years, many decades building certain organizations and projects. We can collaborate. We can work together so for the benefit of everyone. So this is number 4. And finally, is that we realize that as the followers of the school of Ahlul Bayt, we all claim Imam Ali alayhi salam to be our leader and spiritual father. All of us. Who amongst us, when we hear the name of Ali ibn Abi Talib, our heart does not flutter? And before him, we claim the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam as our leader and our spiritual father. And after him, we all join in remembering Aba Abdullah al-Hussein. Look at the power of Imam Hussein. Imam Hussein is that figure who, when the time comes, when Muharram comes, all of his devotees, all of those who love the name of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein, they drop everything and they turn in dedication to commemorating and remembering Imam Hussein alayhi salam. He's a unifying figure for us. So we realize that everyone, despite our differences in our viewpoints, despite our approaches and methods, that we all claim Aba Abdullah and Amir al-Mu'mineen and the rest of the Imams as our leaders, as our fathers, our spiritual fathers. And so is it not sad? You know, one of the most difficult things for a parent, a father or a mother, is when they see there's infighting between their children. Ask any parent. They don't like it. If the kids, they bicker with one another, they fight with one another, there's conflict, this breaks the heart of the parent. Imagine our spiritual father, Amir al-Mu'mineen. Would Imam Ali alayhi salam be happy with us if we are fighting with one another? Would he want us to reconcile, to come together, so that together we can all claim him as our father? Imam Ali spent his entire life in defense of Islam, in defense of the Prophet, in defense of the truth, from the moment he was born until his final moment. And his supporters, they came together and they supported their Imam. Despite all of their differences, they supported their Imam. He spent his entire life all the way until his final tragic moments, when he was struck with a poisonous sword, while he was in prayer in the month of Ramadan. That fateful morning, Imam Ali was struck on his head with that poisonous sword, and he fell to the ground in his mihrab, and he called out, "Fustu wa Rabbil Kaaba." By the Lord of the Kaaba, I am successful. What happened to Imam Ali? Imam Ali, his children, they rushed to him, his companions, they rushed to him. And they saw that he was injured. His head was bleeding. So they rushed to his assistance and aid. Someone brought for him something to wrap his head, his injured head with, because he was bleeding. After a while, his sons, Al-Hasan, Al-Hussein, alayhim as-salam, they carry their father. Imagine, this was Ali ibn Abi Talib. He was a lion on the battlefield. People would run away from him. Who could stand before Amir al-Mu'mineen? Now Imam Ali had become weak. He could not walk by himself. He had to be carried on his two sides by his sons, Al-Hasan, Al-Hussein. They carry him and they take him back towards the house. And at this moment, before they arrive to the house, Amir al-Mu'mineen, he stops them. He says, "My dear sons, stop here. Don't help me anymore. Let me enter the house by myself." They tell him, "Why? Our father, you are weak." He says to them, "I don't want my beloved Zainab to see me in this state. How can she see her father injured like this? How can she see her father with his head, his injury wrapped around and the blood coming from her father's head?" Allahu Akbar. Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, which was more difficult for Zainab to see? Was it more difficult for her to see you while your head was injured? Or was it more difficult for her to see her beloved brother Aba Abdullah al-Hussein with his head severed? Imam Ali alayhi salam, he became very weak. The poison had spread through his body. And during his final moments, he gathered his family and his children around him. Just imagine that beautiful father and his children around him. And he turns to them and he begins to give them his final will and advice. He reminds them of their responsibilities towards Allah and towards one another. And you can imagine, he looks at each one of his children. He is surrounded, he's looking at each one of them. And what is going on in Amir al-Mu'mineen's mind? He looks at his son Al-Hassan. What is going on in the mind of Al-Hassan? What is going on in the mind of Amir al-Mu'mineen when he sees Imam Hassan? Imam Hassan will have a very difficult time after his father. He turns, he looks at his son Aba Abdullah al-Hussein. You can only imagine the heart of Amir al-Mu'mineen at this point. He looks at him and he considers what will happen to his beloved son Al-Hussein after he is gone. He looks around, he sees his daughters Zainab and Kulthum. What will happen to them? One by one he is looking, and then you can imagine, he turns his sight and he sees a young man, Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas, standing there crying over his father. Think of this, that father who loves his children so much and he cares for them. Imagine him calling forward his children, turning to Zainab and saying, Zainab, come forward, my beloved daughter. Then turning to Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas and telling him, Abbas, come forward, my beloved son. Bringing them, telling them, my son, my daughter, give me your hands. Each of you give me your hands. They give them their hands. He takes their hands. He puts the hand of Zainab in the hand of Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas. He says, my beloved Abbas, this is my will to you. Never leave the hand of your sister Zainab. Never. Always keep her. Hold her hand always. Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen. Abbas held the hand of Zainab as long as he could until he did not have his own hands. During those final moments when you passed away, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, you were surrounded by your children and your family. They washed your body. They shrouded you. They prayed upon your body. Then they took you towards your grave and they buried you in your grave. You were surrounded by them. They all participated. But what about your beloved Aba Abdullah al-Hussein, who was left on the desert, on the sand, headless for 3 days without being washed or shrouded or buried? Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين. صلى الله وسلم عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله. صلى الله وسلم عليك وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليكم مني جميعا سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. All together, let us send our salutations. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. And for the souls of all of the marhumin, the mu'mineen and mu'minat, let us recite Surah Al-Fatiha مع الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد.